Okay, so what I thought would be good today would be to recap, because we've missed, some of you have missed a few of the introductory classes, whether you came in late or you were abroad or whatever, and then the tech issues were a serious issue. We had half classes, we had there was a sense of disconnection and momentum just being lost, and a connection between all these systems in Freud and psychoanalysis that I was trying to get across in the first class, where in psychoanalysis generally there's a synthesis, so things aren't in isolation. So we came across the unconscious, and that could be related to the uncanny. It could be just another word for the uncanny. So is that, I'm going to turn that one off, will I? Yeah, too much distraction. So I wanted to recap today and trying to bring together a few things that creates a synthesis between all these words we're dealing with in psychoanalysis. Some are words that we've only come to for the first time, other words we know, but we have a different understanding of them because of popular culture, because the popularization of Freud. So uncanny could become something that we transpose onto things like twins, or the uncanny familiarity, or the uncanny similarity between two things in the world. Whereas in Freud, the uncanny means lots of different things. But it is a feeling of the past bursting into the present, or something like that. So I'm going to go through them bit by bit, and we'll try and get some kind of clarity where there is no clarity. And that's the beginning. I said at the beginning, to come here to understand psychoanalysis, or the theory of psychoanalysis in relation to aesthetics, and this is the word aesthetics, the thinking through this visual sensory world, is very unclear. It's opaque, it's ambiguous. So we have to come to that. So if you say, well, I don't understand that, well, you have to kind of say to yourself, well, what do you not understand about it? And you have to go from there and try to attach certain meanings or theories that we're going to go throughout the module, okay? So in the beginning, I gave an introduction, and I talked about how psychoanalysis was very interested in, it came out of sickness. Really, psychoanalysis that's the first thing we have to remember. We're talking about psychoanalysis in a theoretical vein, not a clinical vein. So psychoanalysis in this vein, in this theoretical vein, is very interested in sickness, but in a theoretical sense. We're not dealing with the other person, we're not the therapist discussing something with the analysand. We're not, we're kind of trying to think about the world, these objects in the world, these aesthetic objects in the world, and we're trying to figure them out through a psychoanalytic lens. And it's just another lens that is the same as philosophy, it's the same as literature, it's the same as kind of things like close reading of things that you get in literary theory. It's that kind of thing. So we're not really dealing with sickness, but we're interested in sickness. We're interested in sickness coming from this dark register, because people who go to psychoanalysis are dealing with traumas, or they're dealing with a past, or they're even the worried well. They don't have to have all this stuff, all this baggage from the past, from their families or whatever it is. They don't have to have all that. They could be a person in the world that just doesn't fit into culture. And it's the outside world that is traumatic. That could be buildings, that could be technology, it could be very banal things in the world. But this is what psychoanalysis is trying to do, and it's a really good way to think about the world because it uses words. Psychoanalysis, in an aesthetic sense, deals with words, and how, as Adam Phillips writes, how we treat each other with words. And also, outside of Adam Phillips, how we treat ourselves with words. How those words that tumble around in our head, those words that some of those words have negative connotations. The weather is miserable. So immediately when you say the weather is miserable, you're placing yourself in this space of negation. Whereas the weather is grey, or the weather is fresh, or you have all these this terminology for describing the world. But it's like what Roland Barthes says about how I don't know which way he puts this, but it goes both ways. So words give away what our body hides, or vice versa. Our body hides what our words give away. I think I've got that right, but I may have said the same thing twice, but reverse. But you know what I mean? It's either our body or our words are hiding things. But it's a binary thing, and it's really in a sense that we're doing both things at once. So words for the psychoanalyst and for us, they're really interesting in terms of how we figure out someone or something in the world and the words they use in conversation. I find it like when you do more and more psychoanalysis, you become very much more aware of things like emails. An email is sent to you, how it's constructed, what words are used in that email. Are they passive aggressive? Are they just casual, nonchalant? But then there's a nonchalantness, and you have to question nonchalantness, and you have to question using adjectives or nouns that are a little bit kind of performative or something like that. So you can, through the reading of an email, through the way in which someone speaks, you can gain a lot from that. So that's what the clinician in the room with the analysand, I'm going to just say the patient, or I don't like using the word patient or client because one is business, one is sickness. I kind of want, just the other in the room, okay, the other in the room. That I've lost my track there, but in a way, like we're interested in what that other is saying and how it relates to us, and how they're, like, in a way, in a philosophical sense, we really don't get the other. We never can. We only can speculate on what they're thinking. And the only way we can get a grain of what they're thinking is through what they say, or how their body moves in space with their words. That's all we can, that's what we depend on. And that's what the clinician in psychoanalysis is depending on, what they say and how they're repeating certain words, how they're describing certain, using descriptions in certain ways, all this kind of stuff that's playing out. I also talked about, in the introductory class, phenomena and the thing in itself. So the phenomena, we're all phenomena here, we're in the world, we're looking at the world through time, space and causality. So I moved a chair today, I sat down, I'm interacting with the world, I'm looking at you guys, These are all phenomena in the world, but you're experiencing the world through this thing called the eyes. And you're perceiving certain things in time and space, and things are always moving, and things are crashing into each other, and it's all that kind of stuff. And then you have another thing called the thing in itself, and that's the thing outside of our perception of it. It's separate in the world. And we wonder, in a sense, whether that thing out in the world actually exists without us perceiving it. Like, so what if it exists out in the world? It only really means something if we recognize it, if we experience it in some way, if we experience the other in some way. Not just through words, but maybe through intimacy. Or maybe the thing in itself is making love. Maybe that's the thing in itself, Or the clash between two bodies. Or, we can play around with this idea, but there are two different worlds in which we're in this head. We're trying to communicate with someone else. We're trying to communicate our thoughts with someone else through this limiting words and language. And we're finding it difficult, as I am here, trying to kind of recap on something that is very ambiguous, it's very paradoxical. What I was thinking about when I was on the train today is I was saying to myself that the deeper and deeper we go into language, like philosophers do, the more paradoxes arise. I think the deepest well of language and experience is just paradox. It becomes a circular argument. So when paradoxes arrive, as they have here, I think, Jack, you presented something in relation to Freud and the Hal Foster text, the pre-sexually sexual. So when we go into this deep well of thinking about things become circular, things become paradoxical. That's why someone and I've mentioned him a few times, Slavoj Žižek loves paradox, because he goes in this deep well of thinking. And I think that's where we arrive at. We kind of bounce back out of this well of thinking, and because it's just paradoxical. The other thing I really want you to take away, and it's in one of the questions I gave you, is this idea of the sensible and the intellect. And the reason every year I give Susan Sontag's essay against interpretation is because it's a perverse thing to do in a psychoanalytic class, because I'm setting up something where we shouldn't be interpreting. We should be experiencing the world, the thing in itself, actually losing ourselves to this sensory space rather than kind of reflecting on it, interpreting it to the point where paradoxes just arise. We're not going to get to any truth here. We really are. True language, I really believe this, we will not get to truth. We will not get to the symptom in Freudian language. The symptom that is on the face, in your words, the illness, the mental illness. Behind that isn't truth. There's a whole web of stuff going on. Some of them are paradoxical, some of them are linear, some of them never end, they're infinite. But we will never get to them through language in some way. Okay? So the sensible and the intellect is posited in Susan Sontag's essay, and I think it's a really important essay, even though there's naive aspects in it. She's a young writer, it's reactionary, it's passionate. She uses words like lame in it. I love it, it's quite friendly, and it's refreshing. It's not an academic paper, but she is a brilliant thinker, and she is a brilliant intellect. And I think if you personalize that essay and you look at it from the point of Sontag, and you think about Sontag, the writer, as an intellect, she's called this giant, she's in quotation marks, giant intellect of American letters in the 70s. Like, she's the giant, she's brilliant. And here she is talking about how the intellect is the revenge on the sensory, it's on the sensible. And she's trying to, you feel, even in her, if you read outside of Sontag's papers, in her diaries, which she has a huge set of diaries, and if you read through them, there's a lot of insecurity about her own thinking, her own intellect, and how she's fighting off this thing, this brain, this brain of words and thinking, and she's trying to engage it with the body in some way, in a more sensory way. So really, Against Interpretation really is about Sontag is much about, what's going on in Yale at the time in literary theory, close reading, Derrida, all this kind of stuff, okay? And I want to read this quote out as well, and this is an important quote by Don DeLillo, and it's from Ratner's Star, and I gave this in the first class. It's an extract from his book Ratner's Star from 1976, and I'm going to read this out, okay? So to bear a name is both terrible and necessary. The child, emerging from the space-filling chaos of names, comes eventually to see that an escape from verbal designation is never complete, never more than a delay in meeting one's substitute, that alphabetic shadow abstracted from its physical source. I think it's wonderful. If you look, review a lot of the stuff we've been doing through this class, it's very much about naming things, designating words onto things in the world, and them slipping off, especially in terms of the aesthetic. They kind of It's like throwing something slimy onto something, and then it just slips off it, and it kind of dissolves into the ground, and then we return to it and we throw something else at it, and we try and get some meaning and understanding from it. But really, in a way, like Delillo, here's this writer, and he's in this, in a way, I've never thought about this, the chapter's called Flow. And there is a psychological space, especially in terms of the writer, flow, where you get into this writing flow and you see the sentence ahead of you and you're starting to chase it and you forget yourself, actually, and you become part of the sentence. Henry Miller talks about this. I forget what he calls a cadenza or something like that, or some kind of, I forget anyway, but where he's writing and all of a sudden he leaves grammar and everything behind, and he ends into this sentence and this flow. And I think this is at the beginning of the chapter called Flow, but really there's a flow in it, in terms of this idea of naming, this idea of designation, this beautiful description, alphabetic shadow, abstracted from its physical source. So this idea of physicality and this idea of the abstract, the abstract shadow in terms of letters, words, names. And it's wonderful that it's placed in this idea of the womb, the child emerging from the space filling chaos. This idea of emerging from the space filling chaos and thrown into the world. I think Heidegger talks about this idea that we're thrown into the world and we're thrown into this environment in which being just takes place, and then all of a sudden we experience the world. We're not full, all of a sudden the world will make us full in some way, or make us a person with some kind of identity. But it's the world itself that will create us in some way. But it's chaotic, in Don DeLille's terminology. Any questions on that before we jump into the next part? No? Is it a little bit clearer? Anyone online? I hope you can hear me. Yeah? They're hiding, are they? Can you hear me? Okay, so next we kind of touched upon dream work. I presented this video by Slavoj Žižek. I really want you to watch it again. Mariah, if you didn't get it at the beginning, it was the second class, and it's really important as a video, and an explanation of dreams in Freud, specifically to Freud. And it pulls in this paradox where he talks about this idea of this indistinct dream that this person has, this woman has. He has a few jokes throughout it that kind of distract, but really, and that's Žižek. If you think about Žižek, he's always performing on YouTube. He doesn't perform as much in his writing, his papers. He's still performing. He tries to be kind of popular culture-ish, but he's more serious in his writing. But he has some really insightful things to talk about in terms of dream work and in relation to Freud. And he talks about this woman having this indistinct dream that she can't really share because it's muddled. She used the word, this idea of muddled. And Zizek talks about how the true content is muddled. This idea, the content is part of the form it takes. So the muddling of a dream is actually part of how we can interpret it. It's part of the content. The muddle is the content, They're both in the same. So it's not that you can't remember it, you're kind of consciously or unconsciously kind of muddling it in some ways because you're repressing something. It's repressed content. So it's a really good example of repression in dreamland rather than in the real world. So you have a less control, of the dream you're trying to control. Like my 8-year-old son said, he's come up with a theory that he says if he kills himself in his dream, he wakes up. Can you believe that? Like, he came up with that the other day. He was trying to figure out ways in which to escape the dreams. And he's now. Listen. I don't know why this is coming up. We're not talking about psychoanalysis to our 8-year-old. But maybe this is another thing I have to really. I think, even though, and this is an example I'm using myself as an example. Perhaps we don't. My wife and myself don't talk psychoanalytic. Well, maybe we do all the time. And our son is picking up on that. So we don't talk about Freud explicitly. We don't talk about the Oedipus complex. We don't talk about castration or repression, any of those words. But maybe psychoanalysis is there at the dinner table all the time, unconsciously. And that's terrifying to me, because I think that's the only way. Now, maybe children say this stuff all the time, but for him to say that to me, the other morning, I found a way to get out. I had to kill myself in the dream. So in the dream, he was having these terrible dreams and he couldn't control them. And he would have a personality that he has to have the room in a particular way and the space in a particular way. And we let him on with that. We don't, say, oh, just have a bit of chaos in your room. We just let him do what he's doing. But in the dream, it's chaos filled. It's like Delillo talks about, it's chaos filled. And so, perhaps that unconsciously we're talking psychoanalytic, and that's where he's coming up with this stuff. So Zizek talks about how this woman with this muddled dream, that the true content, this repressed content becomes formal. It becomes a form, and the muddle is the form of the repressed. And we have to look at that as part of it. So was that clear? I think that's a really good example of dream work and how there's a kind of paradox in it between form and content. And that really is good to transpose onto art and aesthetics, because we're dealing with content and form. And it's something that Sontag keeps on talking about. Sontag keeps on going on about content and form. And why do we have to just always have to have content in the artwork? Why is that the obsession of the contemporary artist? Content, content, content. Why can't he just deal with form? And why are we always searching for content in the artwork? When we watch a series on Netflix and we discuss it the next morning after we've reflected on it, why are we trying to find interpretations in this thing? Whereas when we were in it, we were experiencing it. We were in some ways finding ideal egos in it, as Freud talks about. Where we looked at Laura Mulvey talking about how looking at someone in the cinema, the characters in the cinema, getting lost in those characters, actually becoming those characters. That's an ideal ego. We see ourselves in it. So why can't we just leave it be? Any questions on that?
And then the content is like this hermeneutic type of way in which to understand the art. So it is kind of like an intellectual thing.
It is, yeah. Yeah, so hermeneutics is it's a kind of a horrible word. It's used really in literary theory. And it's a word that Sontag uses, but she doesn't want the hermeneutics of art, she wants an erotics of art. And so, yes, we engage with the form of the thing. Like we engage with someone over there, the form of the object, okay? And then we start to intellectualize. We try to control it in some way. It's like the child, and we'll come to this in a minute, it's like the child and the mirror stage. The child is in this form, is in this wholeness with the mother. Like, it's a beautiful space. Why would you want to leave it? It's warm. I get fed whenever I want. I get held whenever I want. Why would I want to get away from this wholeness with the mother? So, and then all of a sudden, the toddler walks off Maybe he's barely standing, he's kind of struggling, stands up, looks in front of a mirror and sees this wholeness, but it's separate. And it's not a thing that, you know, we talked about this before, if we try to visualize this, and this is always the difficulty of retrospectively or retroactively looking back from adulthood at the child and trying to re-experience that experience when we have no kind of conceptual idea. We've no outside world really. We have the mother, we have all these forms, the breast, the arms, the shoulder, the chin, we have the eyes, we have all this kind of fragmented stuff. It's whole, it's comfortable, it's physically whole, but then we were thrown out into the world and looking at this mirror, which is a fantasy. Is it me? Is it someone else? Is that me, really? You know, and then, oh, that's great, I'm whole. Oh no, I fall into language because I'm actually, after seeing something, I start to speculate. Perspective comes into play. Distance. There's a kind of, it must be horrifying, I can imagine. Or it's joyful, I don't know. It's kind of one of those, it's that binary thing. What is it? What is the truth of it? So, like, yeah, like in a way, and if you re-watch that, you know, or re-listen to that Zizek thing, we do approach, and it's really good at putting it in relation to aesthetics, we do approach this form in the world and this form of expression that the artist has made for some reason. And maybe language has failed them in some way. And maybe they found some formal way in which to express or expel whatever it is they're thinking. Maybe language just, they give up on language in some form. And that is the mode in which they work. I would give an experience as well, and it's not these cliches of left and right brain. I don't really like those things because I think they're binary in kind of, oh, you use your left side. These kind of things are problematic for me because I think, you know, Derrida is a really good guy to listen to because people use the word deconstruction all the time, but really they've got the wrong meaning of it. Deconstruction is involved in binaries, you know, binaries. This left and right, dark and light, whatever the opposite is. And it's about those things existing in the world together and how they bounce off each other. It's like, how can there be a heterosexual without a homosexual, or vice versa? Like, it's this idea of having things in the world, and there's always a relationship with them, you know? So we're too quick to kind of jump on one or the other. So my experience in art school was that you would have to write a thesis at the end of 3 years. But all that other time was formal investigation. It was actually a loss of language. My good friend, he's a painter. He's become quite established now, but he used to know when I was making work and when I was writing, and it was my emails. He used to say, you can't, it's just gobbledygook, he used to call it when I was he said, oh, you're making work now, because I wasn't able to construct a sentence. I had lost language. I was involved in this formal investigation of a thing in the world, and he would say that, oh yeah, you knew when I was making, because I knew him very well. I knew him for years. So he knew when I was making work, and he knew when I was writing, because I was much more cogent and much more, I had much more ability and a flow with language when I was just writing. So words and forms are very distinct. There's a massive gap between them. So that's what Sontag is dealing with. That's what we are dealing with when we walk into a gallery, and we're trying to attach these things in the world. You have the artist's statement in one corner, just telling you one thing. It's kind of filling in the gaps. This is, for me, has always been a problem. They're kind of giving you kind of relevant social, political material that, my work is relevant because it's dealing with gender. It's dealing with Trump. It's dealing with, Syria. Whatever is current now, it kind of fills the gap of this form that doesn't look anything like, if we be truthful about it, really, how have they arrived at this form? Through, looking at Syria. So there is a disparity, but there's always this seduction or a necessary thing for us to try and put words onto things. and to make them relevant by themselves. And this goes, I just want to say one more thing here in relation to this. I brought up this idea of metonymy and metaphor, and these are really important in relation to dream work. So metonymy in relation to dream work was displacement. So if you think of a painter like Magritte, okay, so Magritte is Magritte or something like that, and he would paint things in the world in which there's a fireplace and there's a train coming out of the fireplace or something like that. So he's dealing with metonymy there, and he's dealing with displacement. Whereas metaphor is, in relation to dream work, is condensation. It's the bringing together. It's the kind of condensation. It's that kind of, you could actually relate it to condensation on a window, really. Like, you know, the drips on top of the glass, and the glass looks out onto the world. So you have this condensation of all these properties, these sensory things, the wetness of the window, the shape of the drips, the glass, the reflection of the glass, of you looking perhaps in the glass, and then looking beyond out into the landscape, the light hitting the glass from behind. You have all this thing bringing together, this unity, this unison of things together. And that's another way of thinking about metaphor and condensation. What I would say, like Freud perhaps is much more interested in metaphor and condensation, whereas someone like Lacan is interested in displacement. You never really hear Lacan bringing up metaphor. You know, he loves this idea of displacement, especially in language. He loves things being kind of, you know, unusually juxtaposed, and you know, and a lot of those French writers are like someone like Georges Bataille. You know, he would mix up things together. Words, just, you know, the wooden sky, I think Magritte talks about, or you know, things like this. He'd mix up things to create a kind of unsettling erotics or something, and he's making the world into, it's not a unifying place, it's a world in which strange, sensual, erotic things happen. Okay, so that's the way in which displacement can be used. And then metaphor is a much more, it's a thing we use every day. Metaphor is something we use every day to explain something that we can't explain. We can visualize it in some way. You know, white picket fences, you know, is suburbia. You know, that's kind of a good, you know, in America, you know, something like that. Or and David Lynch, a filmmaker like David Lynch, is wonderful at that, because he uses very cliche, familiar things in the world, like the white picket fence, the overmowed lawn, and the person, you know, that clip I think I showed you of Blue Velvet, you know, the fire engine going through the village, you know, the Dalmatian dog, and the guy waving, you know, all this kind of cliche stuff. And then he makes something strange. He throws in something, you know, like cockroaches underneath the ground or something. He throws in something that kind of unsettles in that. So he's playing with both, perhaps, you know. And in that class, we also looked at Andy Warhol, and we looked at Chelsea Girls, some of his films. We looked at a man's, you know, his voyeuring of people in the world, especially his relationship with certain people, like a man sleeping, and the Empire State Building. You're just focusing the camera on this object in the world and letting time pass by. So, and, you know, like Warhol is really good at, you know, we didn't talk about him too much in relation to the gaze, but he really is. He's not a participant in culture. He looks. We mentioned in the last paper the Diane Arbus paper, Arbus's Freaks by Adam Phillips. We brought up this word, you know, that first quote, and talk about seduction and stuff like that. But Dave Hickey has another essay called the Looky Loos, and it's a phrase. It probably is an American phrase, maybe down in Texas, maybe the Looky Loos. And like Dave Hickey is from Texas, or he's from that part of the world. And there was a term that he used, looky-loos, and it's people who look rather than participate. So it's the people that go to the concert and they're kind of wide-eyed, they're not participating. So it's a good thing to know, like in terms of the gaze. So just say, he uses an example of this country and western singer in Texas. He used to play in these small bars, and he knew all the people in the bar. And he felt at that time that, this is real philosophical from a country and western singer, but it's kind of brilliant. He talked about how this space, this provincial space, he said all these people made him who he was. It wasn't him that made him, it was actually the people he was around. So when they were listening to him playing music in this bar, a small little bar, people smoking, whatever it is, he said they were participating. He was playing, but they were also part of it. They knew him so well, they knew his family, they knew how bad he was in the beginning. The bad experiences. So they were all participating together in some way. But he said when he became famous, I think the country and western singer was Waylon Jennings. He became famous, so he started playing in stadiums. And he said that what happened was he lost all those participants and he got looky-loos in the audience. These people didn't know him. They just heard him on the record, and they were making assumptions about him, but really didn't know him at all. So they were just looking, they were just gazing, kind of listening to the music, experience it like Susan Sontag. But he felt that he had lost all that. He didn't have the same feeling towards the audience. So he felt even he had become a looky-loo, really, and it had kind of, created this, in some ways, a tragedy, because he was much happier in the small bar in Texas, So it's just something to think about. It's going off on a tangent, which is not a tangent, okay? How are we doing with time? I want to continue with this as long as possible, so I want to get any questions in relation to that. Okay. I want to read just this little part I wrote down this morning on the way in the train. So this is in relation to aestheticism, and it brings the artist into it. So this is by a psychoanalyst, Janine Chazogay-Smirgel. It's a great name, okay? But she's mentioned by another artist who's wrote this brilliant essay, and I'll share with you if you want, Mike Kelly. I said Playing with Dead Creatures or something is called. Anyway, he's good to look at in relation to the transitional object. But, okay, this is what he wrote, and he was quoting her, actually. So this is it. Perverts tend towards aestheticism. Isn't that a brilliant opening line? Perverts tend towards aestheticism. They often have a love of art and beauty, and this is likened to the infant's wonder at the accessible parts of their own bodies, and their love of shiny and animate external objects, like dangling pieces of coloured glass. I think that's just wonderful. Now, it's quite abstract, but what Mike Kelly brings it a bit further, and he talks about how Ed Gein, the serial killer, it's brilliant. Now, as an artist, Mike Kelly is coming at this quote, and he's not saying, Janine Chazogay-Smirgel, she's wrong. He's actually taking it on, and he's saying, okay, she believes that artists are interested in shiny things in the world. They're perverts because they're interested in beauty. And they love, access to the, as children, access to the accessible parts of their own bodies. But he goes on to talk about Ed Gein, the serial killer, and how Ed Gein, if you don't know him, he used to go out and kill people, I think the same ages as his mother at the time. I don't know what age she was, but he used to dismember them. And he used to make household items out of them, like lamps other things as well, but he also painted them in silver paint and bits of ribbon. He used to put bits of ribbon on them as well. So he used to make them into kind of dolls in some form. He used to decorate them. So Mike Kelly kind of brings Chazagay Smergel's observational artist and puts it on to kind of serial killers, because, and if we have looked at some artists, and some of the artists I've presented here are a little bit strange, and like Gregor Schneider or someone like that. They're a little bit strange and odd, but they do. Mike Kelly defends them in some way, that he says that they are interested in kind of abstraction as well, and it doesn't have to be something that maims someone or kills the other or is violence towards the other, that there's something else to it. And this is just one case that, and he really disagrees in the end, but he does take the quote as far as it can go, and he tries to kind of, digest it in some form, okay? So, the uncanny. So, the uncanny is something that I really want you all to engage with if you haven't already. And it's really important. It's really, you can put it onto a lot of things, and you can say that the uncanny is just another word for the unconscious. And it also brings up this idea of repression. Things underneath things, and why do these things emerge into the present in this form, in this familiar form. So the uncanny is something that disorientates you, and you walk into a space and sometimes you feel a certain way because you've seen something in the room, or you've experienced some formal setup that has, it could be, I'm not sure if they think, the uncanny. I think it's a visual thing. I think it's a thing that, I'm thinking about smell and hear, and something that you hear in a space, but maybe it's a combination of those things. But usually it's put on to the visual or visual experience of the world. And usually it's a very banal thing. It's not traumatic at all. It's something very familiar. Freud calls it old and familiar. So the uncanny, and we're going to go to the object in a later class, but the uncanny is something dusty. It's from the archive of the self. It's something that emerges into the present, and it makes us feel a certain way. And Freud kind of says that the uncanny, he's taking it from the word unheimlich, which means unhomely, and he's saying there's a paradox in this as well. You're arriving at this space in which should be safe. You should feel content here, you should feel at home here, but all of a sudden you don't feel at home. And that's really terrifying. It's terrifying to not feel at home in a place where you should feel at home. So there's a disorientation, you're intellectually unstable, and he does emphasize terrifying. But he brings up examples of things that, numbers appearing over the course of a day, or a letter addressed to you, all these kind of things but there has to be multiple cases of it. It's not just seeing the number 23 3 times a day. It's seeing the number 23, 100, it's kind of chaotic, this kind of repetition. So that's why it becomes terrifying, because we only can bring accident or coincidence or chance, so far. We explain it away in those ways. Storytelling. So the uncanny is something that suspends something in the world. It delays it. It's enigmatic. This word is really important. Like 3 words to take away, really. Enigmatic signifier. Enigmatic signifier. Something that is in the world, but it loses signification. Okay? So an enigmatic signifier, and I think it's taken from Laplanche. An enigmatic signifier is something that loses signification. We cannot put a sign on it anymore. We cannot make it into a signifier anymore. We cannot put a word on to it to control it anymore. The other word is disavow, and it's something you may have come across in other modules, but it comes up a lot in psychoanalytic thinking. Disavow is not just to ignore something or unacknowledge something that's in the space with you, something that perhaps creates a feeling of uncertainty, shame, whatever it is, you know. It's really to acknowledge it and then disavow it. You've seen it, but then you turn away. And in some ways you repress it. So I gave an example of my son seeing my wife in the shower, naked, and he goes, "Oh, you have no willy." And then he just turned around and started to play away on something else. But it was a complete and utter, I know he said, "Poor you," first of all. I have to always add that in. And then he turned away and walked off and started playing with his toys. But this is like a huge thing. And Freud talks about this idea of the fear of the male castration, you know, and how the male's fear of castration is so big that they, in some ways, try to dominate the female in some form, because that's the way in which they can empower themselves. They have a weakness. There's something there that they feel that they need to fill in some form. And so there's a lack. So desire is found in lack. It's defined by lack. That's the thing. And this lost object in psychoanalysis just keeps on going and going. There are always lost objects in the world, and we're always trying to find them, but really they're defined paradoxically in their lack. We can never find them. You know, that's the biggest, I think, paradox in psychoanalysis. Desire is defined in lack. So what do we do with that in some ways? It really is the biggest paradox, because if we believe in Schopenhauer, who's a precursor to Freud, that being human is just to strive forward, drive forward, striving for something. If you stop striving, then you stop and you die in some ways. So you're striving forward towards death, of course, but you're also trying to repress it. You're trying to acknowledge death, but you're disavowing it. You're getting on with your everyday life. But really, when we think about death is imminent, it's a horrible thought, isn't it? And then we still can get on with getting our coffees and talk about it in some way. But I think sometimes, you know, that's one of the biggest disavowals we have as human beings, that death is on the horizon for all of us, no matter what society, environment we're in. It's there, it's on the horizon. But somehow we get along with it. So that's the biggest disavowal we have as human beings. And in a way, desire is just a distraction. It's just pulling us forward in some way, pulling us forward all the time. So I made an emphasis on this idea of the uncanny as not being dramatic, not being marvelous. It's really, really boring in some ways. And it's boringness, it's familiarity is the thing that really frightens. Because if it happens in the home, a place we're very familiar, even in the dark, if it happens here, then, and this is where it will happen, the uncanny. And this brings us into this idea, and what Hal Foster brings up, and Laplanche as well, I think, the setting. It's in one of the essay titles, the setting. And what I like about this essay question is it takes our attention away from the object of psychoanalysis, the lost object of psychoanalysis, and it throws it onto the setting. And it says the setting is the thing that gives this feeling of the uncanny. It actually also colours in the objects that are there. You know, the setting, you know, it's one of those examples, you know, in when you're teaching painting or drawing, you get students, you know, if they're drawing a still life of a thing, just say an apple, okay? And it's in a cardboard box. You say to them, well, listen, you're not going to be able to draw that apple unless you draw or colour the box, the cardboard box around it. because the cardboard box is the thing that colours it. So if you don't get the box, you're not going to get the apple. So the box, there's going to be bits of the brown box reflected in the apple. So if you don't get the colours of the apple, you're not going to be actually able to describe the box or the apple. They're together. They're not separate from each other. So it goes back to that thing, homosexual, heterosexual. It goes back to all that stuff. There's always a binary, but it's not yes or no, right or wrong. It's kind of, they're both together. They're enmeshed together, entangled, the binaries, all the time. In psychoanalysis, in art, in aesthetics, whatever it is. I'm going to stop in a minute, but I want to just touch upon, we brought up Gregor Schneider as a really good example of the uncanny, because, here's an artist who grew up in a town, and he grew up in his family home, of course, and then he starts building inside of his family home, and he has all this context surrounding this, the home, and now he's doing something strange with this home. This home, I don't know how his home life was. I don't have any of that biographical information. But somehow, maybe it was a perfect home. Maybe it wasn't. And for some reason, he began building a home within a home. And I really don't understand why he did that. It's fascinating from a psychoanalytic perspective why he started building. And why he started to build a home within a home that has these gaps under the floor, that has these corridors between the home that he's built and the home proper, how he squeezes through them. And he's kind of creating some kind of strange womb. And he's building it, it's like one of those Russian dolls. He's like enclosing himself in it. He's creating all these hatches, these little step ladders up into other little wombs. And he's creating this space that's very strange, and it has particular objects to create this uncanniness. But he's not going off, and like I saw, he sold this piece where he's standing in the house and he has an Aldi or a Lidl bag over his head. Okay? And I don't know how he makes an Aldi or Lidl plastic bag, the ones we've seen, if we've went to Aldi or Lidl, over his head. I don't know how he's made that strange, but he has. Somehow, it's the setting around it, it's him standing in the room, whatever he's done, the clothes he's wearing, or it's the history of knowing him and what he's been doing. He's adding on to this kind of strangeness. But it's fascinating why he's ended up doing this, and he needs to do it. As we've seen in the videos, he talks about how uncomfortable he's in these institutions, but he needs to go around the world and show this work. But he'd rather be in the originary space where he started this whole thing. This meant something, and this is kind of taking something away from it. He's inviting all these people in to build stuff. It's not him building it anymore. There's something going. There's a compromise being made. So the uncanny is something that is kind of an involuntary return as well, as mentioned, an involuntary return. So we're pulled into this involuntary memory, repression, something, and we don't want to be there, and we want to pull back out. It's involuntary. We're not allowing it in. It came upon us. And there's other, people have taken Freud's term, or Schopenhauer, these terms have been around the world, in philosophy for a very long time. It's just that Freud has kind of made them into a way of thinking, psychoanalytically, with, that social relationship with the other. Whereas philosophers are kind of dealing with themselves, thinking about the world, and they're trying to go deeper and deeper and deeper. And other people have taken the uncanny and they've said something like, there's this guy, Anthony Vidler, and he talks about how the uncanny sometimes can go from the private to the public, and or the new and the unfamiliar. So that's the new world encroaching in. So that's when the Eiffel Tower in Paris has been built, all this machinery has been built, technology is coming in, and things like agoraphobia and stuff like this being pulled back into the home, being afraid of society. We've seen these things where the world outside becomes a very scary place for individuals, and they just stay in their home. They retreat. They withdraw. Okay, we'll stop it there, guys, because I've went through a lot, and I need to just touch upon a few more things. We take a quick break, okay? I'm just going to pause this recording.
Recording stopped.
Okay, guys. I'm going to continue with this. I didn't think it would take me this long to go through this, but I really did want to get into some kind of depth that would help you in some way to kind of clarify a few things. And because I'm recording it, you can go back over it. I've went off into I kind of reject tangents because I think they're all related. I don't think there's any tangents in thought, really. But it will help to kind of connect some things that I think were lost when our technology failed us and stuff like that. So what I plan now to do, and this is kind of quite organic, is that next week we'll watch that film. There'll be less talk. The sound, I checked the sound in here, is great. And we'll watch that here, and then we'll do the transitional object on top of that. And hopefully we'll have a good, rich discussion which takes in some of the things we discussed today, and also the paper. Because the paper on Edvard Munch is very much a clinical paper by people who are interested in his biography and interested in his life story before a certain age, and his relationship with his family, the debt, significant. We were talking about debt here, and this idea of disavowal. And we could even say a lot of these artists, and even someone like Jordan Wilson, we could say that, this was a question asked of me before about the transitional object. Does the transitional object become at a certain point in the child's life, or does it continue on, into adulthood? Is the transitional object something that Jordan Wilson is dealing with as an adult? Are these objects, transitional objects, that haven't been disregarded? They're just taking different forms in the object, in the art object. And that's a kind of strange idea, and it could be quite an absurd idea, that what artists are dealing with are transitional objects, basically, and they've found this space in which to retain the transitional object. I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just kind of saying that maybe, that's some kind of we could have some circular argument around that, and it would be circular. So, the uncanny. I discussed most of the things in relation to the uncanny. If you're kind of falling in terms of understanding around the uncanny, read Freud's essay again, and that example he uses, Tales of Hoffmann, the Sandman, because in that you have all this stuff playing out, ambiguity, this double inscription of characterization, where one character two characters can become three characters, where the character is displaced into different characters, where the good and the bad, this idea of the living doll. You were talking downstairs about inanimate objects being alive and feeling empathy towards technology. Is that possible? Maybe it is possible. That example that Aoife gave from Venice. You guys weren't part of this, but there was an exhibition in Venice, Venice Biennale, and this is an exhibition on every 2 years, and it's an international art exhibition. And there was this machine made that mops up, looks like blood, and it's mopping up blood in this perspex housing. It's a big, huge machine, kind of monstrous thing, and it's kind of mopping it back and forth. And now it's starting to kind of, because it's constantly on, it's perpetually on, moving and doing all this stuff, it's starting to break down a bit, it's starting to rust. And so, like, this is this idea of having, empathy towards an inanimate object, and this goes on to the transitional object as well. Like, the livelier it is. It's interesting in relation to that machine in Venice, that it's a lively thing. And the signifier, is it blood, or is it just, corn syrup? I don't know. But it suggests this liveliness, this biological thing. And that's why it's disconcerting in some ways, because we're questioning it. We don't know the true answers to it, but it has a liveliness to it. So there's a liveliness in the uncanny. There's something there, and especially in that Tales of Hoffmann, there's something about inanimate objects becoming alive. They're becoming uncanny because they're not real, or are they real? So there's all this stuff playing out in that. Maria Walsh, she's a writer in Psychoanalysis Art, and she talks about this idea of temporal dislocation. And it's something that came up when we were talking about the pre-sexually sexual, this idea of temporal dislocation, but she throws it on to the uncanny. And I talked about how it's very hard to retroactively, think about or experience what a child experiences as an adult. And because we have, over time, armed ourselves with words in a certain way that also make us disavow things, or kind of repress things, or do all this stuff. We collect tools over time to help us out, to create denial in some form, so we can cope. So we've learned in the world that you'll get harmed by doing this certain thing, so you set up a barrier to not let it happen again. And this happens over time, incrementally over time. And words have a really good way of doing that. When we say a word is formed in our mouth and we let it out, we kind of believe it in some form, even though it's absurd. There's a kind of belief system that we're building up through words. And they help us to kind of, put things aside, disavow them, displace them in some way, and so we can move on, and we can strive on, and we can forget about death, and we can keep on going. So there's this kind of, we're arming ourselves all the time. So it's very hard to think about how a child experiences the world without language, first of all. And so they're experiencing the world very directly. So when children acquire language in the beginning, they're very direct because they have no censor. They don't know what's right or wrong. They're curious. Chomsky talks about how the child kind of sublimates, or no, not sublimates, but kind of acquires a word every minute. It's imprinted there, it's done in a minute. Like, I come across a new word and I have to go back to it in adulthood over and over again to remember it, and I'll forget it. But children are acquiring this language at such a rate and such a comprehension that it's terrifying in the first few years. And they're gradually getting the meaning, and they're gradually building themselves up to disavow and deny through language. But in the beginning, they're very direct. They're like, boom, boom. They say as it is. But later, we don't say it as it is, unless there's something going on in us, where we're one of those people that is very direct. And that's usually seen as some kind of ailment or illness, Or they're very direct, there must be something going on there, So that's the problem. So the missing part was by Hal Foster. And this is where I introduced Marcel Duchamp. And I introduced this idea of the ready-made in the gallery. And the ready-made was this urinal that he put in the gallery, and he said, as some kind of claim or statement that this is art, and you can deal with this performative action in the gallery. And Hal Foster's essay follows on from Duchamp and into Robert Gober, who's dealing with Duchamp in his own way, but he's making his own urinals, and he's doing repeated ones. It's not just one statement, and he's making settings, and he's taking all these ready-mades, and he's scaling them up, and he's doing lots of little strange things. He's taking things out of them. They're not full urinals. There's a sound of urinal playing with urinals, and so he's playing with the whole, this tradition that actually Duchamp set up for all artists to follow. And it's kind of this permissible contract that artists can do whatever they want now. They don't just have to paint or draw or sculpt. They can just pick up something in the store and throw it in the gallery, and as long as they create some kind of context around it, it's an artwork, So it's all back down to this idea of content, So the urinal has all this kind of content going on in it. It's saying lots of things without saying it, and it's creating this kind of spanner in the works in relation to what is art and what isn't. And I went on about how the artist has, the idea of the artist has become something very different than it was in, let's say, the Renaissance. So the artist was an artisan. He was someone, or mainly he was someone who made things with their hands. They crafted something with their hands. They were skillful. They were labourers. They were closer to the ground than the philosopher or the poet. The philosopher was closer to God, closer to this kind of metaphysics, whereas the artist was closer to the ground. He cut his hands. He became he sweat, he made these things, he carved these things out of wood or out of marble, whatever it is. So he's very much an artisan. He was a labourer in some way. But the artist now at Duchamp is just something else. It's very ambiguous what the artist is. Duchamp is dressing up, and he's dressing up in the 30s when people weren't dressing up as women, He's playing something that is just very, bisexual. It's bisexual, it's bi-aesthetic, it's pan-aesthetic, it's everything, He's playing the game, and he's using language to do it as well. So the language he uses around his work is very important because it creates more context and ambiguity. It's not about truth. It's about really unsettling things in the world. So Hal Foster kind of puts this idea into our heads that the fantasy is not the object of desire. This is in one of the titles, but it is the setting. And he takes this from Laplanche. And it's this idea of the setting that is important, and I've already repeated, and I won't go over this again, but it's this idea of taking, disavowing the object of desire, the thing that we're lacking and that we're striving for, and thinking about this idea of the setting. How does that condition our experience of art or anything else, the other, Let me see what else I have here. The gaze. Any questions in relation to that? So the gaze was a class in which we read the text by Laura Mulvey and visual pleasure in narrative cinema. And that was a class that really got spoilt by Zoom. And it got kind of thrown all over the place. And it really didn't take off. Some things were said. We talked about the male gaze. Scopophilia. I introduced this film portrait of Zinedine Zidane by Douglas Gordon and Philippe Parreno, and it is the camera, or a series of cameras around this stadium, looking at a football match, and they're all focused, all the cameras are focused on one individual, and it is Zinedine Zidane. And in that 90-minute game, towards the end, on 90 minutes, he gets sent off. And you kind of wonder, is that coincidental? Or is it kind of an unconscious thing that he actually set out to do? It's quite dramatic to do in a film that is undramatic, and it kind of shows the footballer playing football, doing nothing, waiting, gesturing, saying things. Really, most of the 90 minutes is 90% Zidane just walking around, sweating, And so it's this kind of very, we were talking about this idea of the uncanny as banal. It's very banal. It's very familiar. If you're, everyone has seen, even if you don't like football or soccer or whatever you want to call it, everyone's familiar with the game, the pitch. And you realize that by focusing a camera on one individual in that space of, this collective space or community of space where there's participants and there's looky-loos that we talked about there, looky-loos looking down, they're not participating in some form, that there's something very strange about that. And you get a very different view of the world by focusing in, tunnel vision on something. I also presented this other Douglas Gordon film, 24-Hour Psycho. And I showed just a clip of it. And 24-Hour Psycho has no audio, so the audio has been removed from the original film. And it plays out still by still over a 24-hour period. So everything is slowed down. And you get this aesthetic. If you're a pervert and you're interested in aesthetics, I must be a serious pervert. I could watch that all day because there's sequences in it, the tiled shower, the drips coming off the lips that you don't see in the dramatic scene where the character is stabbed in the shower. It's very quick. It has all this crazy music, sound effects, but in this, that's all pulled away. It's all edited back. Time is slowed down. So you get this kind of aesthetic thing playing out. Oh, actually, I'm wrong. It's kind of a sensory thing, that you lose. For me, anyway, I lose the intellect in some way because I'm concentrating on those drips coming down the face, onto the lips, onto the teeth, where they kind of hang off the teeth and drip. And I'm not thinking like, oh, that means, I'm not going there at all. I'm actually experiencing it in a sensory way because everything is slowed down. I also referenced this book, Point Omega, which is, if you're interested in psychoanalysis at all, you should read it. It's really good. It's by Delillo. It's short. It's like 90 pages, maybe, or maybe it's 100 pages. I don't know. It's short. And it opens up with that film of this strange guy in the Met, or in the MoMA, I think it's MoMA in New York, Museum of Modern Art, and he's watching Douglas Gordon's 24-Hour Psycho. And he's a strange character. I talked about this, how it's him looking at this thing and enjoying it in some really pleasurable way, like what Laura Mulvey, like visual pleasure. But he's acknowledging other people coming in to the space. And he's kind of looking at them in the corner of his eye, and these two professors, who he thinks are professors, come in, and he talks about how, they're going to have all the right words. They're going to have all the terminology to understand this. But they're not really understanding it like me, because I'm here day in, day out, from open to close. I'm committed to the physical sensory experience. I'm in the dark, in the corner. I'm real. Whereas they have they've read all the books, and they know stuff. They're not really engaged with it the way I am. So, in a way, Don DeLillo, I've mentioned 2 extracts from Don DeLillo. He's a psychoanalytic writer. Same as Philippe Roth. If you've ever read Philippe Roth, he's a psychoanalytic writer. He went to psychoanalysis for about 15 years. If you read Philippe Roth through, and two of the massive writers of American literature, you know. If you read the two of them through a psychoanalytic lens, they're unbelievable, you know, psychoanalytically. Yeah.
What's the name of the book? Is it Delillo?
Delillo. So Don Delillo. So Delillo. I think there's two L's at the end, but yeah, I think that's it. And it's Point Omega. It's a later book he's written, and it's good. It's good. And a lot of stuff comes out of it that we've been talking about here, especially in relation to the gaze. So 24-hour Hitchcock. What else do I want to say? I've talked about that. Okay, I suppose we'll end here on Adam Phillips, and then any questions. Adam Phillips' essay, Arbus's Freaks, was an essay I gave to you because I wanted you to experience a writer who has got rid of the academicism and the referencing, and he's more engaged in a kind of literature, a letters that is poetic, and he's coming from a place as a clinician. So this is what he does regularly, and he writes irregularly, although he does it routinely every Wednesday. But all the rest of the time he sees a serious amount of people. I don't know what the number was, he said it before, it could be between 30 and 40 people he sees a week. So that's a serious capacity to listen, not talk. You know, this is the problem with psychoanalysis. The cliche around psychoanalysis is the talking cure. It's actually the listening cure. And what you find if you think about going to do a clinical degree is actually it's not about talking, it's about listening. And it's really difficult thing to do. It's really easy to talk, you know, but to listen to someone talk, it's really difficult because we're caught up in our own heads all the time. So psychoanalysis is really, and Alan Phillips, you know, says this a lot, it's a listening cure. And it's on both parts. It's on the clinician side where they're listening to the other, and also on the other side who are listening to themselves speaking and actually trying to discern what it actually is they're saying. And the clinical space, the psychoanalytic clinical space, is a space in which you explore that, whether in free association. You say things in flow. You try to say things. They don't always have to be significant. They don't always have to be dramatic. They could be very banal things, but out of that banality, and usually we find insight in banality rather than in the drama, you know, in the stuff that, oh, that's the reason why they're that way. It's actually, that's a terrible thing to say because usually it's nothing to do with that. It's all these banal things that happen in everyday life are the things that make you who you are. So Phillips, I gave you Phillips because it followed kind of Laura Mulvey, and I also had this other text on the transitional object, which is quite, you know, it's kind of academic or clinical. So Adam Phillips's writing style was important in that he writes in a way that he folds language over and he puts in things very precisely into his text. So close reading, we kind of looked at close reading in the beginning of that, because we just took his quote, the quote he used. And I kind of was really interested in why he used that quote by Dave Hickey. And what was the quote? Oh yeah, so, but we have the right to be seduced. So there's two reasons why he used the quote. First of all, Dave Hickey is an art critic. So he was putting his investigation, he was showing that he was reading art criticism, and Dave Hickey is one of the kind of more enigmatic, brilliant art critics. He's not a journalistic art critic, he's kind of more of a philosopher art critic. I think he studied linguistics first before he became an art critic. He also wrote for the Rolling Stones magazine for years, and he went around just writing on bands from that generation, the 60s and 70s. And he's quite charismatic in his writing and in person. So he's taken this guy's, and Hickey says a lot of this stuff, and he's quite, Hickey will be much more critical-minded, explicitly critical-minded than Adam Phillips, because I think Adam Phillips is very critically minded. But he takes a quote and he just takes an extract, he parses out the sentence and he says, "But we have the right to be seduced." And we talked about seduction and why, what is before that but? What is there? He's left out something, there's something enigmatic there. What was the whole argument before that? And that's the strangeness of quotation, really, or using epigraphs. Adam Phillips, every time he gives a paper, he talks about his epigraphs and at the beginning, where they're sourced, why he's used them. And it's very important to him, not just to throw down a quote because it sounds good. It has to have some kind of context. So, and this is really good to think about when you're writing your paper. Why are you using these quotations? Like, what is important about these? So we talked about seduction as manipulation, intellectual manipulation. It's emotional, it could be sexual. It's something about seduction that you're being tricked in some way, So Hickey talks about how, we have the right to be seduced. So if we go back to that and we try and think about that, like, what does he mean we have the right to be seduced? So there's something strange going on in that claim and that want and that desire. We also talked about Diane Arbus's language, and we took out some extracts of her language, and we saw this idea of secrets, secret and a seeker, or a secret within a secret, and she's playing with this doubling inscription. In Freud, the unconscious is a double inscription, and we talked about this idea of paradox again. When she says something vague or ambiguous or ambivalent about something through a quotation, like what's she trying to do? She's trying to create this kind of binary situation in which there's no really right answer in it, and you're left kind of, stray or something. You're just kind of, you're left, and it's kind of very poetic as well. So you can find, we went back to Adam Phillips and we talked about how Adam Phillips must be very intrigued by her language, because he quotes it so much, and maybe it's very similar to Adam Phillips' language. Because a lot of paradox in Adam Phillips. He loves paradox like Zizek. So there's this, I think, as we said at the beginning of this, deep thinking arrives in paradox. And that's all we can hope for. And if paradox is all we need, then that's great. And if we get enjoyment from paradox, I kind of get enjoyment from paradoxes. I don't want to really dismantle them in some way. I kind of go, oh, that's great, But some people would say, oh, well, they're seductive, and some people perhaps would criticize someone like Slavoj Žižek because he's all paradox. It's like, geez, just please. But it's fascinating how he arrives there, This is something that Phillips wrote, and I think he has some beautiful sentences in that essay. And this is one he writes, and it kind of goes towards this idea of the lost object. The photograph gets you closer, not to the object, but to the photographer's unfolding apprehension of the object. So the photograph gets you closer, not. And he throws in this not. It's really it's written wrong in some way. But it's good because it kind of stops you. You trip over it. So the photograph gets you closer, not to the object, but to the photographer's unfolding apprehension of the object. So there's an unfolding in this. This photographer comes up, and she is looking at the world and she's seeing it unfolding, but there's an apprehension behind it. There's a tension there. She's apprehending it in some way, but there's an ing. This ing, the inging of it is important because it's there, it's happening in the present tense. Even though if we think about the photograph as something that, I talked about my issue, my hang up on photography, because my experience of photography wasn't through a phone, but it was through family albums with my granny on the couch. And all I saw them as mausoleums. I just saw them as this space in which people are all dead. And can I see Uncle? No, he died. It was a constant conversation. No, they're all dead. So I have a serious issue with, the object, especially the photographic object, as a thing that kind of seals in the world. It crops the world. It creates a space in which the past is there and the present is continuing on. And it's static. It's dead. I don't find it lively at all. But in this sentence, I like it because the photograph gets you closer, not to the object. You're not getting closer to this object in the world. And Diane Arbus is not getting closer. She's moving in. She's, going towards these people in Washington Square Park, the prostitutes, the lesbians, the winos. She's, and she's seeing it unfold, and she's recording that. She's documenting that in some form. But she's not getting closer to them. They're still in isolation. She's still isolated away. She wants to get closer, but she doesn't. She wants to show her secrets, but she doesn't. She's kind of, and there's a really beautiful, in her prose, there's a real childhood, beautiful kind of, diary entries that are locked with a golden key and, a pink diary or something. There's that kind of sense that you've opened this diary that no one is looking in, it's private. I always find it difficult, and I do it. I don't know why I do it, but I've read Susan Sontag's diaries, and I kind of wonder, I just read them because I was interested in Susan Sontag as a writer. But when I read them, I feel a little bit guilty about it. And I kind of wonder, how have they emerged into the public sphere? Were they given permission? And I'm, so I've kind of stopped doing it in some way. These letters that, are published posthumously, after the author's death or whatever it is. So there's that going on here. So the secret about a secret is a kind of circular argument again. We're back into this circularity, this is philosophy, back into philosophy. Psychoanalysis and philosophy are very close. And when you look back through the history of philosophy, there's always a tension between them, but they both imbue each other with something really colourful. And that's why I said at the beginning of this class that, when you have psychoanalysis isolated on its own, it becomes a cult. It's a cult of whatever it is, a cult of language, a cult of, highfalutin kind of, for a very esoteric group of people that understand the language. But when it attaches to something, that's when it becomes colourful and enriches the subject it attaches to, whether it's literature, whether it's art or aesthetics. It does something really interesting, film theory, whatever it is, it does something really good with that. Diane Arbus also uses the quote, the proverb, going from boredom into fascination. And if you look up boredom is a kind of reality for me. I'm not saying personally, I think for everyone, boredom is reality. It's real. It's when you really feel yourself in a space and you start to deal with yourself. In a way, you stop striving forward. You're kind of locked into this and you want to find something that distracts or keeps you striving forward. And if you look up fascination, you get, definitions like spellbound, transfix. In a way, fascination is a loss of self. You're transfixed by someone else. There's a kind of a movement away from objecthood into this space that is, you're kind of floating away. You're all in your head, but you're not in your head, and you're kind of floating in some way. So I think that quote or that proverb that you use, going from boredom into fascination, is really important in that text. How are we going? Just want to check. We're going to finish up in a minute anyway. Yeah, we'll finish now. So, and what says, Adam Phillips says one other thing in that text that I've taken out, and that is that in photography the explicit is always misleading. So the thing in itself, the thing that we see in our Diane Arbus's work, it's misleading. It's, if it's an explicit thing in the world, if it's something that, I recognize that, I get that. We say that in the contemporary art space. I get that, I'm fine, now I can move on to the next object. But he's saying that the thing that's explicit in Diane Arbus's work is the thing that's misleading. Okay, so he's leaving that kind of, once again, we're in a space of, well, like, what is this? Where is it leading us to? And be careful of those things that are explicit. They're the things that, we can't trust. And perhaps they're seductive things, seductive formal things. I'm going to stop there because we've only a couple of minutes. Any questions in relation to that? That was a full-on, intense, but I needed to do it because I felt that, unlike other years when we didn't have this issue with Zoom and in person, this kind of conflation between the two, that there was always a problem there, and it created this problem, So it was good to go, for me anyway as well, it was good to go through it and kind of explain to them some things that you can bring into your own thinking around it. And you can re-watch this at a later date. I've recorded it on a mic as well, so hopefully the sound is good on it. Any questions? No? Okay, guys. I'll talk to you next week, and we'll watch that movie. I'll have a 50-minute break. Okay, bye-bye.